Summer 1944. A sunken lane in Normandy, thick with the smell of crushed hedgerow and cordite. A German grenadier crouches behind the hedgebank, listening. Boots. Voices. Then the sound every man on that lane feared. A low, hammering roar, like a machine tearing through the world one round at a time. His squad leader is already down. The Americans are inside the hedgerow now, close enough to touch, and the thing spitting fire at them is not some sleek military rifle. It is squat and heavy and wooden, a barrel wrapped in cooling fins, a fat round drum hanging beneath it like something out of a bank robbery. The grenadier had seen this gun before. Not on a battlefield, in a newspaper, in a gangster picture. It was a hoodlum's toy. It was a criminal's weapon, a thing for shooting rivals in dark alleys. It was also, in that hedgerow, the last thing a great many German soldiers ever heard. It was the most disreputable weapon America ever put in a soldier's hands. It was also one of the most feared close-quarters killers of the entire war. This is the story of how a gun born for the Chicago underworld ended up so respected by the enemy that German troops turned it against the very men who carried it. And it is the story of a truth stranger than the legend, because the way the enemy really got their hands on it is not the way you have been told. To understand why this gun mattered, you have to understand the problem it was built to solve and how badly everyone else had failed to solve it. Go back to the trenches of the First World War. 2 lines of men dug into the mud, separated by a strip of churned earth. The rifles of the day were long, heavy, bolt-action weapons, beautiful for hitting a man at 500 yards across open ground, useless for what actually decided trench fights. Because trench fighting was not a duel at long range, it was a knife fight in a ditch. Men came around a corner of the trench and met the enemy at 10 feet, at 5 feet, close enough to smell them. And at that range, a soldier working the bolt on his rifle, 1 shot at a time, was a dead man. He needed volume. He needed a wall of fire he could carry in his 2 hands and pour into a trench in a single breath. An American Army officer named John Thompson saw this problem clearly. Thompson was not a dreamer. He was a career ordnance man, a soldier who had spent his life thinking about how to arm other soldiers. He looked at the slaughter in the trenches, and he imagined a weapon no one had built yet. A gun, light enough for 1 man to carry and fire on the move. A gun that did not fire 1 shot at a time, but many in a storm. He called the idea a trench broom, something to sweep an enemy trench clean. But everyone had tried to crack this problem, and everyone had run into the same wall. Real machine guns of that era were monsters. They weighed as much as a man. They needed a crew, a tripod, a belt of ammunition, sometimes a barrel of water to keep them cool. You did not carry one around a trench corner. You built a nest and you sat behind it. What Thompson wanted, a machine gun stripped down, small enough to hold, seemed to sit just past the edge of what the engineering of the day could do. The powerful rifle cartridges of the time were too much for a light, fast action to handle. They tore a small mechanism apart. So the problem sat there, unsolved, while men kept dying in the mud at arm's length. The weapon that could end those knife fights in the dark did not exist. Someone had to invent it from nothing. And by the time Thompson and his engineers had it working, the thing it was built for was already over. Here is how they cracked it, and here is the twist that shaped everything the gun would ever become. Thompson gathered a small team of talented engineers, men named Theodore Eichhoff and Oscar Payne, working under his company, Auto Ordnance. Their first breakthrough was a choice, not an invention. If the powerful rifle round was too much for a small, fast action, then do not use a rifle round, use a pistol round. They settled on the .45 caliber cartridge, already carried by the American service pistol. A big, slow, heavy slug. It did not fly far. It did not fly fast. but up close it hit like a swung hammer. And it was gentle enough on the mechanism that a light handheld weapon could fire it again and again without shaking itself to pieces. The result, once they had refined it through the 1920s, was a weapon unlike anything a foot soldier had held before. It fired that fat .45 caliber round somewhere between 600 and 700 times a minute in its military form. Think about that. 10 or 11 rounds every single second, each one a heavy slug that could knock a grown man off his feet. You could feed it from a straight box magazine of 20 or 30 rounds, or from a round drum that held 50, even 100. A single soldier standing, walking forward, could carry that much killing power in his hands. In the trench fight Thompson had imagined, it was not a duel anymore. It was a broom. But the gun had two problems baked into it from birth, and honesty about them is the whole point of this story. The first problem was weight and cost. This was not a cheap stamped-out tool. Early Thompsons were milled from solid steel and fitted with fine walnut, built more like an expensive sporting rifle than a piece of mass war equipment. The gun weighed around 10.5 pounds empty, heavy for something you carried all day. And it was staggeringly expensive. In the 1920s, a single Thompson could cost around $200, which in today's money is well over $3,000. That is more than twice what the Army would later pay for a full-sized Garand battle rifle. A weapon that expensive and that heavy was a hard sell to a peacetime army, counting every dollar. The second problem was the twist. The gun had missed its war. Thompson's team got the design working right as the First World War ended in 1918. The trench broom arrived with no trenches left to sweep. Here was a finished, brilliant, terrifying weapon, and an America suddenly at peace with no soldiers who needed it. So the question became, who on earth was going to buy a compact, rapid-firing, .45 caliber killing machine in peacetime America? And the answer to that question is what gave the gun its name, its reputation, and the whole legend we are untangling today. Because the people who bought it were not soldiers at all. If you are the kind of person who wants the real history under the legend, not just the myth everyone repeats, subscribing keeps these stories coming. The buyers were gangsters. This was Prohibition America. Alcohol was illegal, which meant it was enormously profitable, which meant organized crime was flush with cash and at war with itself over territory. And here was a weapon sold openly, with almost no restriction, that could empty a magazine of heavy slugs into a rival in a matter of seconds. The mob did not care that it was heavy. They did not care that it cost a fortune. They had the money, and they had the need. The Thompson went to Chicago, and Chicago made it infamous. It earned a whole vocabulary of nicknames that dripped with menace. The Chicago Typewriter, for the clattering rattle of its fire, the Chicago Piano, the Chopper, the Tommy Gun. On February 14, 1929, in a Chicago garage, gunmen using two of these weapons cut down 7 members of a rival gang against a brick wall. Investigators pulled about 70 spent .45 caliber casings off that garage floor. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre put the Thompson on the front page of every newspaper in the country, and it stamped the gun with an identity that would follow it for the rest of its life. This was not a soldier's weapon. This was a criminal's weapon, a symbol of lawlessness itself. And then the world went to war again, and everything the gun had been shamed for became exactly what it was worth. When the Second World War came, the United States discovered it still had no other weapon like it. The Thompson was the only submachine gun America had ready to go, and suddenly the whole world wanted them. The gun that had been a national embarrassment became a national asset overnight. It went to the paratroopers who jumped into the dark before the invasions. It went to the Rangers who scaled the cliffs. It went to the Marines fighting yard by yard through Pacific jungle, where a fight might explode at 10 feet and be decided in 3 seconds. In that world, the gangster gun was king. Nothing else an infantryman could carry put out that much heavy fire that fast at spitting distance. The men who carried one rarely wanted to give it up. Audie Murphy, who would become the most decorated American soldier of the war, used a Thompson crossing a river in Italy, cutting down German gun crews at close range. In the frozen chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, a paratrooper sergeant named Leonard Funk, cornered and outnumbered, emptied a full Thompson magazine into a German officer and turned a hopeless capture into a fight his side won, an action that earned him the Medal of Honor. Story after story, the pattern held. When the range closed and the fight turned into that knife fight in the dark that Thompson had imagined decades earlier, the men who held a Tommy gun tended to be the men still standing at the end. Even Winston Churchill got caught in the gun's strange gravity. In 1940, inspecting Britain's defenses, he was photographed gripping a Thompson, chin out, glaring at the camera. Britain wanted to look defiant. Instead, German propaganda seized the image, reprinted it on leaflets, and used it to brand Churchill exactly the way America's newspapers had branded the gun. A gangster, a criminal, wanted for murder. The gun's reputation was so heavy that the enemy tried to hang it around the neck of a head of state. Which brings us, at last, to the enemy themselves, and to the claim at the heart of this story. Did German soldiers really turn the Tommy gun against the men who carried it? Yes, but the true story is stranger and better than the legend, and getting it right is the whole point. Start by being honest about the competition, because the enemy had good reasons not to need the Thompson at all. The Germans carried their own submachine gun, the MP-40. It was cheaper, lighter, cleverly built from stamped metal with a folding stock, easier to control and far easier to mass produce than the finely machined American gun. Further east, the Soviets fielded the PPSH-41, a weapon so crude, so cheap, and so fast to build that they made something like 6 million of them. 6 million against roughly 1.5 million Thompsons. Next to those two rivals, the American gun was a craftsman's luxury item in a war that increasingly ran on cheap, stamped, disposable tools. On paper, no German soldier had any reason to prefer a heavy, expensive foreign gun over the light, modern one already in his hands. And yet they took it anyway, because up close, quality still counted. The Thompson was rugged. It was superbly built. And that heavy .45 slug hit harder than almost anything else in that weight class. A German soldier who found one and who could find ammunition for it had gotten his hands on a genuinely superior close-quarters weapon. But here is where the legend and the truth split apart. The picture in the title of Germans stripping a Thompson off every dead American in Normandy is not really how it happened. The German military kept careful catalogs of captured foreign weapons, and the captured Thompsons in their records carry a code that means Russian. Not American, Russian. Because the largest single source of captured Thompsons was not the Western Front at all. America had shipped well over 100,000 Thompsons to the Soviet Union to help fight Germany in the East. The Soviets, whose whole supply system ran on a different cartridge, made little use of them, and huge numbers fell into German hands on the Eastern Front. That is where most of the enemy's Tommy guns came from. Soviet stockpiles captured by the ton, an American gun taken from a Russian ally rather than an American body. There were captures in the West, too. When German forces wiped out an American Ranger force at Cisterna in Italy in 1944, they took the Rangers' weapons, Thompson's among them, and there are photographs to prove it. But those were the exception, opportunistic prizes, not a standard practice. And there was a hard limit on all of it. That .45 caliber round the gun depended on was an American round. The Germans built their whole logistics around a different cartridge. A captured Thompson was only as useful as the captured ammunition a soldier could scrounge for it. Run out of American bullets, and the fearsome gangster gun became a heavy, useless club. That single fact, more than any battlefield bravery, is why the enemy's love affair with the Thompson stayed small, local, and short. They prized it when they found it. They just could rarely feed it. The Americans, meanwhile, had already spotted the gun's real weakness themselves. It was simply too expensive and too slow to build for a war this size. Late in the conflict, they introduced a crude, stamped, ugly replacement called the grease gun that did nearly the same job for about 1/10 the price. On paper, it made the Thompson obsolete. And still, given the choice, plenty of soldiers clung to their Tommy guns and refused to trade down. The gangster gun had earned that kind of loyalty. Go back to that sunken lane in Normandy. The German grenadier behind the hedge bank, hearing that low hammering roar, watching the squat wooden gun with the fat drum swing toward him. He had first seen that weapon in a newspaper, in a gangster picture, a hoodlum's toy, a criminal's plaything. Everything about it said it did not belong on a real battlefield. He had it exactly backwards. The thing that made it infamous, that brutal, close-range storm of heavy slugs, was the exact thing that made it deadly in his hedgerow. The mob had not corrupted a fine weapon. The mob had simply been the first to understand what it was for. A trench broom built for the knife fight in the dark that had finally found the war it was made for a quarter century too late. And that is the strange truth under the legend. The enemy did turn the gangster gun against the men who built it, but mostly with weapons captured from a Russian ally, and only for as long as the American bullets held out. The gun America was ashamed of became the gun the whole world reached for the moment the shooting got close. Sometimes the weapon a nation is most embarrassed by turns out to be the one it needs most, standing in a muddy lane at arm's length when there is no time left to reload a legend.